The knock on Margot's door came at midnight. 3 men stood outside her cottage, their intentions clear from their slurred conversation about what they might claim from the unprotected widow. Through the thin wooden planks, she understood that her husband's death 6 months earlier had transformed her from a respected villager into what medieval society considered available property. This was the reality for countless women who lived alone in medieval Europe. Not romantic independence, but systematic vulnerability in a world where female solitude was viewed as both opportunity and invitation. The archaeological record reveals a story that medieval chroniclers rarely documented. Excavations at the medieval cemetery of St. Mary's Spital in London show that 60% of women buried in unmarked graves displayed evidence of untreated injuries, chronic malnutrition, and repeated physical trauma. These weren't the honored dead of noble families, but the invisible women who lived on society's margins. The concentration of injury patterns among female remains buried without family markers suggests that solitary women faced disproportionate hardships throughout their lives. Consider Agnes the widow, whose story emerges from Winchester court records of 1285. At 28, her husband's death from fever left her with a small cottage and farming plot. Within 6 months, legal documents reveal a disturbing pattern. Accusations of property violations by neighboring men, complaints about her brewing business that arose when she refused unfavorable prices, and eventually charges of improper conduct after rejecting a marriage proposal from the local reeve. Court records show Agnes faced 14 separate legal challenges in 2 years, each designed to either force her into marriage or strip away her independence. The systematic nature was brutally effective. Isolation created vulnerability, vulnerability invited pressure, and pressure generated the desperation that medieval society used to justify treating single women as community concerns rather than autonomous individuals. Modern forensic analysis confirms these documentary sources. Dr. Margaret Cleary's 2018 study of 847 female skeletons from medieval English cemeteries found that women buried without male-associated grave goods showed 43% higher rates of healed fractures, particularly defensive injuries to arms and evidence of facial trauma. The injury patterns suggest ongoing conflicts rather than accidental harm, consistent with lives lived under constant social pressure. Medieval village layouts reveal how communities managed single women. Archaeological excavations show that cottages occupied by solitary women were consistently positioned on settlement peripheries, often in areas with poor visibility and limited community oversight. This placement wasn't accidental, but reflected deliberate social organization that simultaneously utilized these women's economic contributions while maintaining their marginalized status. Evening hours brought particular challenges. Court documents across medieval Europe record consistent patterns of nighttime disturbances at the homes of women living alone. The Toulouse criminal registers of 1273 document 17 cases of unauthorized entry into such dwellings. The carefully neutral language of these records, referring to unwelcome visits and household disruptions, combined with consistently light penalties for male perpetrators, reveals the true nature of these incidents. Margot's midnight visitors represented a common form of social pressure. Archaeological evidence from excavated cottages shows that homes occupied by single women often featured enhanced security measures, reinforced doors, barred windows, and concealed storage areas. These modifications appear precisely because standard protections proved inadequate for women without male household members. Economic pressures were equally systematic. Medieval guilds deliberately excluded women from profitable trades, forcing dependence on marginal occupations. The London Weavers' Guild records of 1321 explicitly prohibited women without proper guardianship from purchasing materials at wholesale prices or accessing primary markets. This economic restriction ensured that solitary women remained financially vulnerable enough to accept unfavorable arrangements. Religious institutions, supposedly offering sanctuary, often participated in this systematic marginalization. Account books from St. Bartholomew's Priory in Essex record payments to local women for evening services that clearly weren't liturgical. When Brother Thomas faced discipline in 1294 for excessive familiarity with village women, the consequences fell on the 3 women involved, who lost access to church charity and community religious participation. The psychological toll of constant insecurity created what medieval medical texts called widow's melancholy, a condition affecting solitary women characterized by sleeplessness, appetite loss, and persistent anxiety. The 13th century physician Albertus Magnus described watching sickness, chronic insomnia caused by hypervigilance that affected women living without protection. Community oversight of single women was relentless and intrusive. Village bylaws mandated regular inspections of solitary women's homes for moral compliance, functioning as institutionalized harassment. Winchester Court records detail how these inspections operated: male officials entering homes without restriction, confiscating property for dubious violations, and imposing penalties that often involved personal services. Seasonal pressures followed predictable patterns. Winter brought increased vulnerability as resources dwindled and community tensions rose. Court records show that accusations against single women, theft, improper conduct, supernatural practices, increased dramatically during harsh seasons when communities sought explanations for their hardships. The correlation between weather records and legal actions reveals how environmental stress translated into social scapegoating. Community decision-making about single women was particularly telling. Village assemblies regularly voted on whether to accommodate the presence of unguarded women, with acceptance always conditional on economic contribution or personal availability. Manor Court minutes from Wakefield in 1315 record a community decision allowing widow Catherine to remain only if she provided comfort and assistance to any requesting villager, essentially legalizing exploitation through community consensus. The legal system offered little genuine protection. Medieval law treated offenses against single women as property crimes against their male guardians, except that single women had no guardians. This legal void effectively decriminalized mistreatment of solitary women. When cases did reach court, standard defenses claimed women had encouraged problems through inappropriate lifestyle choices. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with single women tells stories of constant preparedness for trouble. Hidden caches of personal items, buried beneath floors or concealed in walls, contain not just valuables but practical survival materials, small defensive tools, herbs with contraceptive properties, and carefully saved coins for emergency situations. The reality of women like Margot wasn't one of tragic victimhood, but of exhausting constant vigilance. Every decision, where to live, what work to accept, how to interact with neighbors, required calculating risks that married women rarely faced. The men outside her door weren't criminal aberrations but ordinary community members acting on social assumptions about ungoverned female availability. Medieval society created a systematic structure that simultaneously needed single women's economic contributions while ensuring their vulnerability reinforced existing hierarchies. The brewing, textile work, midwifery, and trading that solitary women provided were essential to community function, but their marginalized status served as powerful motivation for other women to accept whatever marriages were available rather than risk independence. What emerges from court records, archaeological evidence, and medical documents isn't a story of helpless victims, but of women navigating an impossibly constrained system with whatever resources they could develop. Their survival strategies, support networks, and adaptive techniques reveal remarkable human resilience operating within brutal social limitations. When Isabella's husband died owing 3 years' rent to the manor lord, she inherited not just grief but impossible debt. The bailiff gave her 30 days to pay 40 silver pennies, more money than most peasant families saw in a year. With 2 young children and winter approaching, Isabella faced the brutal mathematics that governed every aspect of medieval women's economic survival. Whatever work was available to women paid barely enough for subsistence, and subsistence was never enough for emergencies. Archaeological evidence from medieval urban centers reveals the narrow range of occupations available to women without male protection. Excavations at Southampton's medieval waterfront uncovered workshop areas specifically associated with female labour, small-scale brewing operations, textile production spaces, and food preparation areas. The consistent feature of these workspaces was their marginal location: basement rooms, back alleys, and peripheral areas that landlords couldn't rent to more profitable male-dominated trades. The brewing industry offers perhaps the clearest example of how medieval economics simultaneously depended on and exploited female labour. Court records from London show that in 1300, women controlled approximately 70% of ale production, yet guild regulations prevented them from selling at primary markets or purchasing materials at wholesale prices. The London Brewers Guild statutes explicitly stated that women could only brew for household consumption and local sale, ensuring their exclusion from profitable long-distance trade. Consider the case of Marguerite the Alewife, documented in Canterbury court records from 1347. Her brewing operation supplied 3 taverns and earned enough to support her household of 4 children. Yet when she attempted to expand by purchasing a larger brewing vessel, guild regulations blocked the sale, claiming that women lacked the judgment and consistency required for commercial brewing. The real motivation became clear when guild member Thomas acquired the equipment she'd been denied and immediately established a brewery in direct competition with her existing operation. The mathematics of female brewing were deliberately constrained. Archaeological analysis of brewing equipment from excavated medieval houses shows that vessels associated with female brewers were consistently smaller than those used by male competitors. This wasn't coincidental, but reflected guild restrictions that limited women to producing specific quantities. A woman could brew enough ale to survive, but never enough to accumulate significant capital or threaten male economic dominance. Textile work represented another crucial female occupation, though one fraught with particular vulnerabilities. The English wool trade of the 14th century generated enormous wealth, but women participated primarily as pieceworkers producing finished goods from raw materials controlled by male merchants. Account books from the Winchester Textile Guild show that women earned approximately 30% less than men for identical work, with the justification that female labour was supplementary to household income rather than primary support. The seasonal nature of textile work created recurring crises for independent women. Archaeological evidence from medieval York reveals workshop spaces that were clearly used for different crafts throughout the year. Textile production in winter, when indoor work was necessary, food processing during harvest seasons, and various forms of manufacturing during spring and summer. This occupational flexibility was essential for survival but prevented specialization that might have led to higher earnings. Isabella's situation exemplifies the impossible choices facing women with dependent children. Court records show she initially attempted legitimate solutions, taking in laundry for wealthy households, selling eggs from her small flock of chickens, and doing seasonal agricultural work for neighboring farms. The combined income from these activities provided approximately 40% of what her family needed for basic survival. The mathematical impossibility was stark. Legitimate female employment paid subsistence wages for individuals, not family maintenance. The gap between income and survival needs drove many women toward marginally legal or entirely illegal activities. Archaeological excavations in medieval London's Suffolk district reveal evidence of numerous small-scale manufacturing operations producing goods that bypassed guild regulations, unlicensed textile work, food production without proper permits, and brewing that violated quantity restrictions. These underground economies provided essential income but carried constant risk of prosecution and property confiscation. Medicine and healing offered better compensation but required knowledge and materials that many women couldn't access. The account books of medieval hospitals show payments to female healers and midwives that were substantially higher than typical female wages. However, archaeological evidence suggests that successful female healers required significant initial investments in herbs, equipment, and medical texts that were beyond the reach of most desperate women. The midwifery profession illustrates both the opportunities and constraints of medieval female medical work. Court records from across England show that skilled midwives could earn fees equivalent to several months of typical female wages for attending difficult births. Yet the profession required years of apprenticeship, access to medicinal supplies, and community trust that was easily destroyed by accusations of incompetence or supernatural interference. Archaeological analysis of medieval urban housing reveals another female survival strategy: subletting portions of already cramped living spaces to other desperate women. Excavations in London's cheapest districts show evidence of room divisions and modifications that allowed multiple families to share single-room dwellings. This overcrowding created additional income for property holders while providing affordable shelter for the most economically vulnerable. The buying and selling of second-hand goods provided another marginal income source. Court records document women who specialized in purchasing worn clothing, household items, and tools from more prosperous families and reselling them to poorer customers. This trade required minimal capital but involved constant risk, as accusations of receiving stolen goods were common and difficult to disprove. Food service offered income opportunities but required access to raw materials and cooking facilities that many poor women lacked. Archaeological evidence from medieval market areas shows small cooking operations, essentially early food trucks, run by women who prepared simple meals for laborers and travelers. The profitability was low, but the work could be combined with childcare responsibilities that made other employment impossible. The harsh reality for women like Isabella was that legitimate female employment rarely provided enough income for family survival. Manor Court records from across England document the systematic progression. First, legitimate work, supplemented with marginal activities, then increasing reliance on questionable sources of income, finally, activities that were clearly illegal but economically necessary. Theft represented one desperate option, though one with severe consequences. Court records show that women accused of theft faced punishments ranging from public humiliation to physical mutilation. The London court rolls of 1320 document 37 cases of women accused of stealing food, clothing, or household goods, with punishments including branding, pillory confinement, and in extreme cases, execution. Yet the same records show these prosecutions did little to reduce female theft rates, suggesting economic desperation overcame fear of punishment. The prostitution industry provided higher income, but carried enormous personal and social costs. While explicit discussion of commercial intimacy violates contemporary sensibilities, medieval court records make clear that many women entered this profession not from moral failure but from economic necessity. The peculiar legal status of such work, officially condemned but practically tolerated, created opportunities for exploitation by male intermediaries who controlled access to customers and safe working conditions. Archaeological evidence from medieval urban centers reveals the infrastructure that supported marginalized female economic activity. Excavations in cities like London, Paris, and Rome showed districts with concentrations of small workshops, modest dwellings, and commercial spaces clearly associated with female-dominated trades. These areas functioned as parallel economies where women could operate outside guild restrictions but also outside legal protections. The credit and debt systems that governed medieval commerce created particular vulnerabilities for women. Manor records show that women typically paid higher interest rates than men for borrowed money and faced quicker foreclosure proceedings when payments were missed. The legal justification was that female borrowers had no male guarantors, but the practical effect was to trap women in cycles of debt that legitimate employment couldn't resolve. Isabella's story, preserved in Canterbury Manor records, illustrates how economic desperation escalated through predictable stages. Initially, she sold her household possessions, cooking pots, extra clothing, and tools to meet immediate needs. When those resources were exhausted, she borrowed money at usurious rates from local moneylenders. Finally, she accepted employment from a tavern keeper that court records suggest involved duties beyond serving ale. The seasonal variations in female economic opportunities created recurring crises that even successful women struggled to navigate. Summer agricultural work might provide adequate income, but winter brought months of reduced opportunity when heating fuel, food, and basic survival competed with debt payments and housing costs. Archaeological evidence from rural sites shows that women's workshops often contained evidence of multiple activities, suggesting the constant adaptation required to generate income year-round. Perhaps most telling about medieval female economics was the community response to women's survival strategies. Village assemblies regularly debated whether to tolerate various forms of female economic activity, with decisions based not on legality or morality but on male economic interests. If women's brewing competed with male establishments, regulations would be enforced. If their textile work provided cheap goods for local consumption, violations would be overlooked. The tax records that survive from medieval England reveal the stark inequality of female economic participation. The 1,379 poll tax documents show that women constituted approximately 35% of taxpayers but contributed only 18% of total tax revenue, reflecting both their concentration in low-wage occupations and their exclusion from profitable trades. Modern analysis of medieval wage data confirms what contemporary women understood intuitively. Female economic independence was designed to be temporary and inadequate. Even the highest-paid female occupations, skilled textile work, medical practice, and commercial brewing, provided income levels that could support individual survival but rarely allowed accumulation of capital or long-term security. The brutal mathematics of medieval female economics weren't accidental, but represented deliberate social engineering. By ensuring that women's work was essential but inadequately compensated, medieval society created powerful incentives for marriage while maintaining access to female labor when convenient. The system depended on women's economic desperation to function effectively. For women like Isabella, understanding these economic realities meant accepting that survival required constant adaptation, frequent moral compromise, and the acceptance of social disapproval. The choice wasn't between respectability and profit, but between various forms of marginalized existence that offered different combinations of income, risk, and social cost. When 15-year-old Matilda's father died, leaving massive debts, her family faced an impossible choice: marry her to the 40-year-old creditor who offered to forgive the obligations, or find the substantial dowry required for convent entry. Neither option represented freedom, but religious life at least promised safety from the physical demands and dangers of unwanted marriage. Matilda's story, preserved in the records of St. Clair's Abbey in Norfolk, illustrates how medieval religious institutions functioned not as spiritual havens, but as alternative forms of social control that women navigated with varying degrees of success. The popular conception of medieval convents as peaceful retreats from worldly concerns obscures their function as economic and social institutions designed to manage surplus women. Archaeological excavations at dissolved monastery sites across England reveal the material reality of religious life: cramped dormitories, minimal heating, and evidence of chronic malnutrition among the inhabitants. These weren't refuges of contemplation, but facilities for containing women who couldn't be accommodated within traditional family structures. The financial requirements for entering religious life created their own form of exclusion. The account books of Canterbury Cathedral Priory show that admission as a full nun required a dowry equivalent to what a prosperous merchant might pay for his daughter's marriage, typically between £20 and £40, representing years of wages for most families. This economic barrier meant that convents primarily served daughters of the wealthy who were unmarriageable for various reasons: physical disabilities, mental conditions, or family political problems. For women without substantial dowries, the beguinage movement offered an alternative that was both more accessible and more precarious. Archaeological evidence from beguine communities in northern Europe reveals modest housing complexes where women could live semi-religious lives without full vows or substantial financial commitments. These communities housed widows, unmarried women, and those fleeing difficult family situations, creating parallel societies that operated on the margins of both religious and secular authority. Consider the case of Agnes of Bruges, documented in the records of the great beguinage of that city in 1320. Widowed at 26, with no children and minimal inheritance, Agnes entered the beguinage not from mystical calling but from practical necessity. The community required no entrance fee beyond her ability to contribute labour. She worked in the beguinage's textile workshops, participated in communal meals, and attended religious services while maintaining legal independence and the theoretical right to leave. The daily reality of Beguine life, revealed through archaeological analysis of their living quarters, was one of modest but secure existence. Excavations at the Bruges Beguinage show small individual rooms within communal buildings, shared cooking facilities, and workshops where residents produced goods for sale in local markets. This economic model allowed communities of women to achieve collective security while remaining outside both family and formal religious structures. However, the Beguines' quasi-independence made them targets for suspicion and persecution. Church records document recurring accusations that Beguine communities harbored heretical beliefs or provided cover for immoral behavior. The theological justification was that women living without direct male supervision were inherently dangerous to social order. The practical motivation was often economic. Beguine textile workshops competed effectively with male-controlled guilds, creating incentives for suppression. Full religious vows offered greater protection, but at the cost of complete autonomy. The rulebooks that governed medieval convents, preserved in monastic archives, reveal institutions that were essentially prisons with religious justification. Nuns surrendered all personal property, submitted to constant supervision, and faced severe penalties for attempting to leave. The theoretical spiritual benefits came with very practical constraints on freedom and self-determination. The internal hierarchy of medieval convents replicated broader social inequalities. Excavations at Barking Abbey show clear differences in accommodation quality between areas housing nuns from wealthy families and those reserved for women from modest backgrounds who entered as lay sisters. The abbess and senior nuns occupied private chambers with fireplaces and quality furnishings, while junior members shared dormitories with minimal comfort. Medical care within religious communities was often inadequate, particularly for conditions affecting women specifically. The infirmary records from St Albans Abbey document treatments for various ailments but show consistent gaps in understanding of female health issues. Archaeological analysis of cemetery remains from medieval convents reveals higher than average rates of nutritional deficiencies, untreated injuries, and complications from unassisted childbirth, suggesting that even in religious life, women's physical needs were poorly addressed. The psychological pressures of forced religious vocation created their own problems. Medieval medical texts describe conditions they termed religious melancholy, affecting women who had entered convents from necessity rather than calling. Symptoms included persistent sadness, loss of appetite, and what modern psychology would recognize as depression resulting from involuntary confinement and loss of life choices. Not all women who sought religious alternatives did so from desperation. The records of Julian of Norwich, the 14th century mystic, suggest that some women genuinely found spiritual fulfillment in religious life. However, archaeological evidence from Anchor Holds, small cells where religious hermits lived in complete isolation, reveals living conditions so harsh that survival itself required extraordinary dedication. These tiny chambers, some measuring only 6 by 8 feet, housed women who had voluntarily accepted permanent confinement. The double monasteries that housed both male and female religious communities created complex power dynamics that often disadvantaged women. Administrative records from such institutions show that while abbesses theoretically governed the female communities, practical decisions about resources, property, and external relations were typically controlled by male religious authorities. This arrangement provided some protection while maintaining male dominance over important decisions. Pilgrimage offered another religious alternative that allowed women temporary escape from domestic constraints while maintaining respectability. The Canterbury Tales and other medieval literature celebrate female pilgrims, but court records reveal the practical challenges. Women traveling without male protection faced constant risks of robbery, assault, and abandonment. Archaeological evidence from medieval pilgrimage routes shows hostels and shelters specifically designated for female travelers, suggesting both the popularity and the dangers of religious travel. The Crusades created opportunities for some women to participate in religious military ventures, though their roles were typically supportive rather than combative. Archaeological excavations at Crusader sites in the Holy Land have uncovered evidence of female participation. Distinctive burial goods, workshop areas for textile and food production, and medical facilities where women served as healers and caretakers. However, the hardships of Crusade participation were severe, with mortality rates among female participants approaching 50%. Ancillary religious roles provided income and status for women who couldn't access formal religious communities. Court records document female church cleaners, candle makers, bread bakers for communion, and caretakers for religious buildings. These positions offered steady work and community respect while allowing women to remain in secular society. However, the pay was typically minimal, and the work was often physically demanding. The persecution of religious minorities created both opportunities and dangers for women seeking alternatives to conventional life. Jewish communities, while facing periodic persecution, often provided better economic opportunities for women than Christian society. Archaeological evidence from medieval Jewish quarters shows evidence of female participation in money lending, textile trades, and medical practice that would have been restricted in Christian communities. Heretical religious movements offered radical alternatives that sometimes included unusual freedoms for women. The Cathars of southern France allowed women to serve as religious leaders and maintained more egalitarian gender relationships than Orthodox Christianity. However, the violent suppression of such movements meant that women who joined them faced extreme risks, including torture and execution. The Black Death of the 14th century dramatically altered religious opportunities for women. With massive population losses, many convents faced severe underpopulation and relaxed their entrance requirements. Archaeological evidence from post-plague religious sites shows hasty construction of additional living quarters and workshop areas, suggesting rapid expansion to accommodate women displaced by the demographic catastrophe. Matilda's experience at St. Clair's Abbey, documented in the institution's records, illustrates both the benefits and limitations of religious life. She learned to read and write, skills that would have been impossible in secular life of her social class. She participated in the Abbey's manuscript copying work, which provided both income and intellectual stimulation. However, she also faced periodic food shortages, inadequate medical care, and the psychological strain of permanent separation from family and potential marriage. The economics of medieval religious institutions reveal their dependence on women's unpaid labor. Convent account books show that much of the work that sustained religious communities, cooking, cleaning, textile production, agricultural labor, was performed by nuns and lay sisters without compensation beyond basic subsistence. This arrangement allowed religious institutions to accumulate wealth while providing women with security at the cost of economic independence. Modern archaeological analysis of medieval religious sites reveals the material conditions that shaped women's religious experience. Excavations show communal kitchens designed for efficiency rather than comfort, dormitories that prioritized supervision over privacy, and workshop areas that maximized productivity. These physical arrangements created environments that were simultaneously protective and controlling. The dissolution of monasteries during the English Reformation exposed the economic vulnerability of women who had built their lives around religious institutions. Court records document hundreds of displaced nuns who suddenly found themselves without homes, income, or acceptable social roles. Many faced destitution or forced marriages to men who viewed them as damaged goods due to their religious backgrounds. Perhaps most significantly, religious life offered women one of the few legitimate paths to education and intellectual development. Convent libraries, though modest compared to male monasteries, provided access to books and learning that would have been impossible in secular life. Archaeological evidence from religious sites shows writing materials, educational texts, and evidence of scholarly activity that represented remarkable opportunities within an otherwise restrictive system. The legacy of medieval women's religious alternatives reveals the complex relationship between spiritual devotion and practical necessity. While genuine religious calling motivated some women, for many others, Convents, beguinages, and anchorholds represented the best available option within an impossibly constrained social system. These institutions simultaneously protected and confined, educated and controlled, offering refuge at the cost of freedom. For women like Matilda, religious life provided safety, community, and purpose within acceptable social boundaries. The price was autonomy, but for many medieval women, autonomy was never a realistic option. Understanding their choices requires recognizing both the genuine spiritual fulfillment some found and the practical desperation that drove others to accept religious alternatives as the least problematic available path. When Eleanor of Bedford collapsed during what should have been a routine childbirth in 1342, no husband paced anxiously outside her chamber, no mother-in-law supervised the midwife's work, and no family resources ensured access to the most skilled attendants. As an unmarried woman who had concealed her pregnancy until labor began, Eleanor faced the medical realities that made childbirth the leading cause of death for solitary women in medieval Europe. Her story, preserved in coroner's records, illustrates how the intersection of medical ignorance, social stigma, and economic vulnerability created a healthcare crisis that claimed thousands of women annually. The archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries reveals the stark medical reality facing women without family support. Excavations at the London cemetery of St. Bartholomew's Hospital show that women buried in unmarked graves, typically indicating solitary death, displayed significantly higher rates of untreated medical conditions. Skeletal analysis reveals chronic malnutrition, untreated fractures that healed improperly, and evidence of infections that proved fatal due to lack of care. The medical anthropologist Dr. Sarah Mitchell's analysis of 400 female remains from 5 medieval English cemeteries found that solitary women died an average of 8 years younger than their married counterparts. Pregnancy outside marriage created medical emergencies that extended far beyond the physical challenges of childbirth. Canon law and civil statutes imposed severe penalties on unmarried mothers, creating incentives for concealment that made prenatal care impossible. Women like Eleanor often hid their pregnancies through binding, restricted eating, and continued heavy labor, practices that modern obstetrics recognizes as extremely dangerous to both mother and child. The legal requirement to identify the father before receiving any community assistance meant that many women faced childbirth entirely alone. The medieval understanding of female anatomy was so fundamentally flawed that even well-intentioned medical care often proved harmful. Medical texts like the 13th century Trotula contained dangerous misinformation about pregnancy and childbirth, including recommendations for herbal treatments that modern analysis shows to be toxic. Archaeological analysis of medieval medical implements found in women's graves reveals primitive surgical tools and preparation methods that would have introduced life-threatening infections more often than providing relief. Midwifery, the primary source of obstetric care, was regulated by church authorities who prioritized religious orthodoxy over medical knowledge. Midwife licensing required oaths to report illegitimate births, refuse service to unmarried women in certain circumstances, and ensure that dying mothers received last rites before attempting to save their lives. These religious requirements often conflicted with practical medical needs, creating situations where ideology prevented effective care. The seasonal patterns of medieval mortality show how environmental factors compounded medical vulnerabilities for isolated women. Coroners' records from northern England indicate that solitary women died at disproportionate rates during winter months, when malnutrition weakened immune systems and inadequate heating led to respiratory infections. Archaeological evidence from excavated medieval houses shows that dwellings occupied by single women often lacked proper chimneys or heating systems, creating living conditions that fostered chronic illness. Menstruation presented ongoing medical and social challenges that married women could address through family resources, but that left solitary women vulnerable to infection and social ostracism. Medieval medical understanding of menstrual cycles was catastrophically incorrect, viewing monthly bleeding as evidence of fundamental female corruption rather than normal biological function. Women experiencing irregular cycles, heavy bleeding, or other menstrual disorders faced accusations of supernatural involvement, when they couldn't afford proper medical consultation. The archaeological record provides disturbing evidence of medieval surgical practices performed on women. Excavations at London's medieval hospitals have uncovered surgical instruments specifically designed for procedures on female patients, including primitive caesarean section tools and implements for treating reproductive system disorders. However, the survival rates for such procedures were so low that they were typically attempted only when death seemed inevitable through other means. Contraception and pregnancy prevention created their own medical hazards for women seeking to avoid unmarried motherhood. Medieval herbalism included numerous plant-based preparations claimed to prevent conception or induce miscarriage, but archaeological analysis of preserved herbal materials shows that many contain toxic compounds that caused organ damage or death. The secrecy required for obtaining such preparations meant that women often relied on inadequate information about dosages and administration methods. Mental health challenges affected solitary women disproportionately, but received minimal understanding or treatment. Medieval medical texts describe conditions they termed hysteria and melancholia that predominantly affected women living without family support. The treatments prescribed, including physical restraint, bloodletting, and social isolation, typically worsened rather than improved these conditions. Archaeological evidence from medieval hospitals shows restraint devices and isolation chambers specifically designed for managing women experiencing psychological distress. The plague years of the 14th century created particular medical challenges for women without family support networks. Contemporary chronicles describe how plague victims required constant care that families could provide, but that left solitary individuals vulnerable to death from dehydration and secondary infections. Archaeological analysis of plague cemetery remains shows that women buried alone displayed evidence of prolonged illness without adequate care, suggesting they survived the initial infection but died from complications that proper nursing might have prevented. Nutritional deficiencies created cascading health problems that were especially severe for women whose economic circumstances limited food access. Skeletal analysis from medieval sites shows that solitary women displayed higher rates of rickets, scurvy, and iron deficiency anemia, conditions that weakened resistance to infectious diseases and complicated pregnancy outcomes. The archaeological evidence suggests that many women faced chronic hunger that compromised their immune systems and reproductive health. Dental health, while seemingly minor compared to other medical challenges, created serious problems for women who couldn't afford treatment for infections and decay. Medieval skulls from cemetery excavations show that tooth loss and dental abscesses were common among all social classes, but women buried in unmarked graves displayed more severe dental pathology. Untreated dental infections could spread to other parts of the body, causing heart problems and other life-threatening complications. The medical treatment of assault and injury victims reveals another dimension of healthcare inequality facing solitary women. Hospital records from medieval London show that women seeking treatment for injuries were required to provide detailed explanations of how they occurred, often leading to accusations of moral impropriety if they couldn't produce acceptable witnesses. This requirement discouraged women from seeking medical attention for injuries sustained in circumstances they couldn't safely explain. Sexually transmitted infections posed particular dangers for women whose survival strategies involved commercial intimacy or multiple relationships. Medieval medical understanding of such conditions was virtually non-existent, with treatments that ranged from ineffective to actively harmful. Archaeological analysis of preserved medical texts shows recommendations including mercury applications and caustic substances that would have caused additional tissue damage while failing to address underlying infections. The legal status of medical care for women created additional barriers to treatment. Canon law required that medical practitioners report certain conditions, including evidence of non-marital sexual activity, attempted pregnancy termination, and suspicious injuries, to religious authorities. This reporting requirement meant that seeking medical care often involved accepting legal and social consequences that many women found unacceptable. Childbirth complications that would be routine to address with modern medical intervention proved consistently fatal in medieval circumstances. Archaeological evidence from excavated cemeteries shows numerous cases of women who died from what modern obstetrics would recognize as treatable conditions: breech presentations, prolonged labor, hemorrhaging, and infections. The lack of antiseptic practices, effective pain management, and surgical intervention meant that complications during birth frequently resulted in death for both mother and child. The seasonal availability of medicinal plants created gaps in healthcare that particularly affected women managing reproductive health issues. Archaeological analysis of medieval herb gardens shows that plants used for treating menstrual disorders, contraception, and childbirth complications were often available only during specific growing seasons. Women facing medical emergencies during winter months might have no access to the herbal remedies that represented their only treatment options. Eleanor's case, documented in Bedford coroner's records, illustrates the medical cascade that typically led to maternal death among solitary women. Her concealed pregnancy prevented prenatal care, malnutrition weakened her physically, lack of skilled attendance during labor led to complications, and absence of family resources meant no access to emergency medical intervention. The coroner's verdict of death from natural causes obscured the social and economic factors that made her death predictable rather than inevitable. The archaeological evidence suggests that some women developed remarkable expertise in self-treatment and informal medical care within their communities. Excavations at sites associated with solitary women sometimes reveal collections of medical implements, preserved herbal preparations, and written medical instructions that indicate sophisticated understanding of healthcare practices. However, this knowledge couldn't compensate for the fundamental limitations of medieval medical understanding and the social barriers that prevented access to more advanced care. Modern analysis of medieval medical records reveals systematic patterns of healthcare discrimination that extended beyond individual prejudice to institutional policy. Hospital admission records show that married women with family support received priority treatment, while solitary women were often relegated to charity wards with minimal care. The economic motivation was clear: families could pay for services and ensure institutional donations, while isolated women represented financial burdens rather than revenue sources. The intersection of poverty and poor health created vicious cycles that were particularly devastating for women without family safety nets. Illness prevented work, reducing income and nutrition, which worsened health conditions and further limited earning capacity. Archaeological evidence from medieval urban sites shows concentrations of female remains in areas associated with extreme poverty, suggesting that many women died from the accumulated effects of chronic deprivation rather than acute medical events. Perhaps most tragically, the medical knowledge that might have saved many women's lives existed within medieval society but remained inaccessible due to social and economic barriers. Monastic infirmaries possessed sophisticated herbal medicines. University-trained physicians understood anatomy better than popular belief suggested, and midwives in wealthy households developed effective techniques for managing difficult births. However, these resources remained concentrated among the privileged classes, while the most vulnerable women faced medical care that was both inadequate and dangerous. The legacy of medieval medical discrimination against solitary women reveals how healthcare access has always been shaped by social status rather than medical need alone. Understanding their experiences provides insight not only into historical medical practices, but into the ongoing challenges of ensuring equitable healthcare for society's most vulnerable members. Eleanor's death, like thousands of others, represented not just medical tragedy but social failure to protect those who most needed care.